And I'd like to welcome Sophie Baker, who's the Commercial Director, Australia New Zealand from Pulsar. She's going to talk about how to utilise the data at your fingertips for more effective planning, research and execution. So Sophie leads the Pulsar business for Australia and New Zealand. She's responsible for building a new and growing team with the remit to launch a social listening and audience insights multi-product solution. Sophie joined Pulsar in 2016 and led the mid-market new business team, overseeing the growth of market share in the UK, EMEA, and eventual entry into the North American market in 2018. Sophie has a passion for helping clients to derive greater meaning from data. Welcome.
So nice to meet you all. Good morning. Despite what the title of the session today portrays, I'm not going to make you get up and start doing jumping jacks and burpees, so don't worry about that. As my accent might tell you all, I'm not from Australia, nor am I from New Zealand. I'm from the UK. And I only recently came to Australia at the beginning of April, thinking that I'd be leaving behind this, you know, the great British summer, what everyone typically knows and understands, and thinking I'd be doing a lot of this. But actually, it's very much not being the case. But the reason that I have come to Australia is to introduce Pulsar into a new market. We've never had any kind of position in certainly ANZ or even more broadly APAC previously, but are here as a result of our new relationship with Isentia, who I'm sure lots of people in the room today are very familiar with. So Isentia are now our sister company, and that relationship was brokered out of an acquisition from our larger global group that acquired Isentia at the end of last year that has created a huge opportunity for Pulsar to enter into this market, of which I'm kind of leading that, that cause. So Pulsar is what we term ourselves to be is an audience insights company. I'm sure many of you in the room are very familiar with kind of typical classic social listening tools, maybe social media analytics. And Pulsar's slightly different. And we feel we're very much bringing a new ethos in terms of social data and social research to the market. So we were uniquely born out of a market research agency in London about 10, 11 years ago. And we developed from a need from our existing client base at the time to begin to incorporate social data and social research into some of the existing methodologies that we offered for our clients. So those were things like more traditional qual research, ethnographic research, focus groups, online communities. We ran surveys, that kind of thing. And when we looked out to market at the time, we found that a lot of tools that were available were heavily quant focused. So they were largely concerned with counting the volume of mentions of a brand online and maybe looking at kind of, you know, basic sentiment analytics. And we wanted to go further. We wanted to understand the people behind those online conversations in the same way that we could understand people behind typical kind of qual research methodologies, like I say, in focus groups and through ethnographic studies and that kind of thing. So that's really where we've come from, and that kind of modus operandi continues to be the way that we approach research. It's very audience-led, and it's all about kind of consumer insights and understanding people behind those conversations. Suspense. So our approach, I've skipped past, let me go back. So our approach is all about trying to identify early predictors of trends. And from that kind of social upstream standpoint. So I know, you know, what's very kind of familiar and very embedded, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, is this focus on traditional media, which offers us a huge amount of value when we begin to understand pertain narratives that are being spread socially, culturally, politically. But what we tend to find now with digital spaces ever more becoming the frontier of reality and socialization is that those narratives have begun elsewhere, earlier, at an earlier stage. And that's what we call the attention trail. So beginning largely on social. What we want to do is then map those trends and how that narrative spreads from an upstream perspective, from social, then through traditional media, and then into behaviors. And those behaviors can then be identified through things like search attention. So how people behave when they're looking to query a topic or an issue, a cultural trend or a political movement. That then behavioral mode begins to happen on search and can then be effectively monitored through an attention into first-party data. So what I mean by first-party data is then those things like consumer sales stats and survey data and polling data and that kind of thing. So by bringing all of those data indicators together in an attention trail, we can effectively identify those early indicators of audience behavior and audience insight. So a really fantastic use case for this of how social trends are an early indicator of public perception is Brexit. I think that what we saw in 2016 ended up vastly being a shock to an entire nation in terms of a huge political movement. And that shock was felt because the indicators and the predictors that we saw through mainstream media definitely did not portray or predict ultimately what the outcome was going to be. And that's largely because we ignored those earlier indicators on social. So this is a really interesting tweet from the famous whistleblower, Edward Snowden, that came out on the result day of the referendum. And so it's interesting to begin to understand how the conviction to vote in a certain manner, arguably in the case of Brexit, with very little information about what the impact would be on society or an entire political system, actually came from somewhere else prior to that polling data, prior to even the narrative that was coming through from traditional forms of media. And I think there was, very much a somewhat similar situation recently with the Australian election. Albanese obviously ended up coming into power on a landslide, which really hadn't been predicted in mainstream media, but that actually if we'd have paid attention to social, then, the writing may have been on the wall. And that's essentially what we're always trying to identify, is how can we look to uncover those early indicators of trends and opinions and attitudes that spread to such a viral degree. And I know the speaker before me mentioned this. Once virality has taken hold within an online space, within an online ecosystem, it's very difficult to then slow that down. And that will then kind of filter through from those upstream sources into downstream, more traditional sources, and then from what we see from people's behavior. So if we look at an analysis of some of the responses, feedback, engagement, reactions ultimately that we saw on social from Nigel Farage's pro-Brexit campaign, the numbers were huge, drastically greater than the reactions that we ever saw to the Remain campaign. And so that attention trail was lost by a lot of reporters and commentators and ultimately by government. So that I think this was just quite a funny meme that I thought actually really nicely summed up the shock and surprise that, an entire nation felt following that perceived understanding of what the outcome would be around the referendum vote. Pretty nasty, actually. So how do we go beyond surface level social listening? So traditional social listening is basically what you're looking at here, is what most people think about when we talk about social data analytics or beginning to surface insight from online spaces. It's bar charts, it's line graphs, it's word clouds, it's sentiment analytics, it's maybe looking at the volume of conversation, and it's quite heavily focused on quant stats. That certainly gives us an indicator as to scale and scope of a conversation, but organizations and particularly government organizations may not necessarily see a huge shift in what's going on by focusing on quant stats alone. We're not seeing any kind of qualitative nature of that conversation, the feeling, the attitude, the people behind it that are real individuals. They're not online stats. They share media in a certain way. They have a particular demographic profile. They have a certain socioeconomic status. They are driven by regionalism. All of these kind of nuances as to who they are as individuals. And so we really do need to begin to explore behaviors as a predictor for longitudinal change, whether that be, political, social, cultural, but ultimately longitudinal change that feeds into public perception, and how that might have a downstream effect then on how government agencies can effectively plan comms or engage stakeholder groups or look to effectively research policy change. So to do that, we can't just track mentions of a campaign or an issue. We really then need to begin to understand the people behind it. So that's really what our approach is to social research. It's audience as the lens through which to read the conversation. It's advanced mapping of a conversation and certainly analytics around things like trends and themes and influential authors that are contributing to that conversation, but very much through that lens of audience segmentation. So looking at identifying demographic profiling and unique affinities and bringing those communities together that are like-minded, that all may discuss the same topic, but in a very different way according to what their persona profile is. So it's about looking at nuance and then using that nuance to directly inform any of your strategic thinking. So really it's about being able to create messaging that resonates with a multifaceted audience, and something that we say time and again at Pulsar to our clients is to remember that your audience is not a monolith. It has those nuances, it has those defined features, it has those persona profiles, and they're impacted by behaviors and by cultural impact ultimately as well. So what I'm going to take you through now for the remainder of the session are some really interesting case studies. I'm basically going to tell you some cool stories around how some of our clients use Pulsar, our government clients, use Pulsar in their day-to-day workflows and to impact special projects, but also in an ongoing manner to help inform policy research, stakeholder mapping and engagement, and then comms planning. Disclaimer, a lot of these are UK or global focused, but definitely have a resonance across any kind of government organisation. So our first use case is NHS. So the NHS England, and then also lots of its subsidiaries, so its individual trusts and business units, have been a long-standing client of Pulsar. And they specifically used Pulsar to look to understand changing perceptions around primary and elective care policies in light of COVID-19. So it was a huge study that we ran with them. And some of their objectives were largely just around looking to understand how their audience, which ultimately is an entire nation, could be segmented with a regional view to look to understand how services were being used and perceived within different regions, so that ultimately the NHS could use that insight to inform operational decision making. So whether that be around provision of resources, of specific services in certain regions according to need and demand, but also to direct budgeting and budgeting decisions post-pandemic. After COVID-19 had completely overwhelmed the healthcare system for a good 18 months to 2 years, they needed to understand how to redirect those services and that budget to make sure that Britons that ultimately were being serviced in the right way for their healthcare needs. So what we initially did was map the conversation. We needed to understand at a national level what were the main concerns that were being discussed. So to just explain the visual that you're looking at there, we cluster major trending themes of conversation into kind of like-minded topics. So by identifying subtopics of conversation and then drawing them together into these overarching themes, we get a sense of what the main threads are that are being engaged with by the audience. So the broader topics here were largely kind of around NHS and services, primary and elective care and treatments. So those were things like surgeries for major disease areas like cancer, for example, but also primary care like, GP services that were largely being discussed. But by then segmenting those overarching themes and beginning to look at the subtopics, we could begin to explore some of the more minute concerns that people had around the services. And that largely focused on things like response rates, and particularly in relation to vulnerable individuals. So how those with cancer, for example, were being treated in light of an entirely new healthcare landscape where they were vulnerable to, the high spread of a virus like COVID-19 in hospitals, and how they were going to receive the proper care that they needed, the surgeries that they needed, with COVID-19 being so rampant still, particularly in a lot of care service destinations like hospitals, like GP surgeries. So you can see from that tweet that there's a lot of highly emotive content that comes through from these concerned individuals, from vulnerable patients. And that was something that the NHS needed to act upon pretty quickly and make sure that these individuals weren't being overwhelmed, their needs weren't being overwhelmed by the priority of the pandemic response. So what we then looked at was how this conversation proliferated from a regional focus. And we found that actually conversation in different regions vastly differed. What we saw in big metropoles like London was that there was just a high demand on general medicine and a real complaint around the availability of GP appointments for primary care. And a lot of the themes that came through from this discussion were around the fact that mental health services and sexual health services had basically just been completely eliminated in light of COVID-19 and particularly post-pandemic, when the public perceived that actually we should be getting back to our new normal. They expected to see those services up and running again, and the fact that, you know, resources were being pumped into them and that budget should be pumped into them. So we saw this largely in kind of main metropoles, but particularly in London. And then in more regional areas, we saw this high concern for elective care. So a lot of themes coming through around the deprioritization of patients, particularly with cancer, particularly cancer patients that were in need of elective surgeries to help them, you know, battle ultimately life-threatening illness that just weren't being properly cared for, which we also saw, you know, in that tweet as well. So it allowed the NHS to just be more effective in their operational directiveness, in how provision of services was meted out in different regional areas. And actually, as a result of the study that we did with the NHS, they launched an entire new programme for pop-up cancer diagnostic centres in certain regional areas, where they were doing a lot of early prediction of things like lung cancer, of blood cancer, in specific hubs where they were seeing this kind of conversation that was taking place, and ultimately where they knew from statistics as well that there were a lot of individuals that were, you know, might experience cancer as a result of, you know, being already diabetic, for example, or smokers or whatever it might be. So really using that social data to help provide scale and scope behind some of that more traditional research that they were also doing. And then the next example here is actually a really interesting example. It's not tied to a client necessarily, but something that we did looking at a cultural trend. So mapping the anti-vaxxer conversation and specifically looking to understand how the proliferation of misinformation takes place within key communities, but what we might also call stakeholder groups. Now, rather than just purely mapping the conversation here, what's incredibly important is looking at understanding the audience behind that conversation. So again, just to explain the visual, what we're seeing here is that each of those individual colored nodes represents an author. And they are then an author that sits within a like-minded interest group or community, or what we might call stakeholder group, all ultimately explaining what we see online as a tribe, an online tribe. And then the connectivity of those nodes through the threads that you see in the visualization shows how each of those groups and those individual authors within those groups spreads content, how they share content, how they share opinion, how they talk to one another essentially within the online space. So by mapping these unique audience communities and how they share content, we can begin to understand how narratives are influenced and ultimately how conversation goes viral within the online space. So each of these different individual groups that we've got here have a different take on the conversation around anti-vaccine. So we've got some traditional kind of American conservatives that you see in the blue, represented in the blue. They typically wouldn't necessarily contribute to conversations around, you know, conspiracy theories or anything that's a bit more alternate and more extreme right-wing. But what we're seeing in the visual, which is really interesting, is that they're highly engaging in conversation and sharing content with conspiracy theorists. And something that we uncovered from that content sharing and mapping those different community groups was that there was a major theme or trend of conversation that was coming out around a Netflix documentary that had been released at the time. So this was a documentary basically looking at how the CDC in the US had destroyed a study back in the early 2000s, which proved a link between the MMR vaccine and autism. And it caused an absolute viral sensation online, and obviously something that conspiracy theorists would kind of pick up on and run with, but not that necessarily our more middle of the road conservatives would engage with. But we saw this huge engagement and this tie in those threads of conversation between those two different audiences, which created massive virality for this conversation around this documentary. And then you've got your other kind of more left-leaning liberal groups. So you're kind of pro-vaccine, both metropolitan Americans, and we looked at a big UK pro-vaccine audience as well. So even though we're seeing each of these 4 individual groups engage in this one same conversation, we know that actually their take on it, the discussion that they're engaging in, is very different. And we can then begin to look at how those community groups are influenced. So this is essential to understanding the proliferation and kind of perceived and retained truths that travel within the online space. So if we understand, who the media outlets are, who the influencers are, who the high-profile individuals are, who the government departments or organizations are that these people are influenced by, we can then begin to get a sense of what their take on a discussion might be and how they engage in a belief system within the online space. And so it's unsurprising that when we take a really focused glance at our kind of right-wing or our right-leaning conspiracy theorists and also our conservatives, that they showed a massive over-indexation on influence from people like Donald Trump, but also, kind of far-right bloggers, viral influencers. And that's what you're seeing in the visualization there. So each of those individual influential authors are showing a major over-indexation of engagement and affinity within our conspiracy theorist community versus any of those other communities that existed within the total audience. And then if we look at what those drivers of beliefs are from a narrative standpoint, we can see that the conversation is drastically different. That our American conservatives and our conspiracy theorists and researchers are using specific hashtags like vaccine injury and vaccine death to proliferate a whole load of content around anti-vax belief systems, whereas that's not coming through from obviously our pro-vaccine contingent from the audience. And again, I know I kind of keep overstating this, but it's incredibly interesting to look at what is ultimately a very broad conversation around anti-vax through the lens of that audience profiling and that audience segmentation. Because even though all of these different groups of individuals are contributing to that conversation, they're contributing to it in a very, very different way, with different attitudes and different opinions. And if we'd have just broadly mapped that conversation according to the topic of anti-vax or anti-vaccine, without doing it through the lens of those persona profiles, we wouldn't have understood the nuance in the discussion whatsoever, or ultimately how content spreads. And then this just, next slide tells us very much the same thing, that different communities talk about the same topic, but differently. And so the conversation that we see proliferate through the structure of those audiences and how that commands an entirely different virality model in terms of spread of content really tells us everything about how belief systems and truths are disseminated. And then finally, what we identified through this study is that visibility or highly visible content or opinion is very different to credibility. So something that we always look to explore, particularly when we're looking to identify misinformation, is through our index that we do in partnership with NewsGuard. So this is where we can begin to understand the credibility of content that proliferates through different audience groups. So we can prioritize that ongoing monitoring. We can identify misinformation narratives early, and then ultimately we can predict misinformation outbreaks, which for our government agency clients is essential in them being able to combat any misinformation through more effective comms and more effective comms planning. But really the closing message of the boot camp today is that we should always look to approach social research and social insight through defining the audience, segmenting the audience, clustering that conversation according to that segmentation, and then ultimately personalizing the message. So your key takeaways from the boot camp today are that social is always an early indicator to attitude or opinion, so don't ignore it as an upstream predictor. The audience defines the message, and that ultimately targeted messaging equals much better advocacy, stakeholder engagement, and more effective comms.